So at this point, I'm going to assume that you've finished the circular flow matrix. My PowerPoint here is just going to be adding into a few pieces. So if you've not yet managed to fill in all of the spots, I'm going to point out we are focusing on this government section with the taxes, welfare, public goods, etc. that we're going to be filling in on this next unit. So make sure you have all these pieces. Feel free to stop my video here and finish writing whatever you need. The circular flow model is looking at both public and private sectors, the part that's controlled by the government and the part that is run by individuals. It's also looking at the factor payments and the transfer payments. These are the things that the government is spending money on, as well as the subsidies, which are payments to businesses. The model review, we're looking at individuals supplying and demanding. We're looking at businesses supplying and demanding. Remember that the product market is the one where we normally do the shopping unless you are a supplier of a good, and the resource market is where we are normally the producer of our land, our labor, and our capital. Here's what I'd like you to do. If you've got a partner next to you, go ahead and see if you can figure out the effects with the graph that you've created in front of you. So if consumers begin to save more and spend less, where it's going to have an effect, you should be able to trace it all the way around to all four parts. Obviously, starting with the consumer, should be starting with the households. Same thing with the government. If they're increasing taxes on a consumer, what is that going to do? What are the consumers going to have less of? And then how is that going to have an effect? Same thing with businesses laying off workers. The government increasing subsidies to farmers. Careful, that's not necessarily going to be in the same spot you might expect. And then if we have a gas line that breaks, it causes a gas shortage. See if you can go ahead and go through all of these pieces and see if you can use the circular flow model to explain everything. Stop this video now. All right, we're going to pick up right where we've got off. All countries have three macroeconomic goals. We're trying to create economic growth. That's pushing out our PPC curve. We're trying to limit unemployment, and we're trying to keep prices stable. That is limiting inflation. We're going to look at how we measure each one of these. And the number one thing is looking at economic growth. With that, we're going to have something called national income accounting, or better known as GDP. GDP is the gross domestic product. It is the dollar value of all the final goods and services produced within a country in 1 year. You'll see the identification pieces here. I'm going to point out that as part of your study guide, your problem set, I would encourage you to go ahead, stop here, and fill that in. Make sure you have all of those pieces because you do need to know them. It will be part of the Quizlet when we come back in. GDP doesn't tell you as much as you would think. It does look at how we're doing financially, but we're going to need to use it to do something else. So for example, we're going to need to use it to compare 1 year to the previous years. Did we actually see growth, or did we just see things becoming more expensive? Did we see a policy change where we have more taxes, less taxes, and are we going to have a better policy working? And then how do we compare to other countries? That one ought to be pretty easy. I'm betting you could tell me the countries that have the highest GDP. So maybe stop, take a guess, take a look around, and here we go. Remember that GDP is simply all the production possibilities that we have, goods and services, and it's not going to be too terribly crazy. You've got these three top ones here, although you know my personal opinion about the European Union. You'll notice that Germany is outstanding with 4,000 of it just in themselves. France down here with another 3,000. They're kind of cheating by playing ball with us, but you see the U.S. and China obviously taking up the majority of it there. When you start down at the bottom, you're also going to notice that most of these are extremely small. Matter of fact, if you've even heard of Tokelau or Tuvalu, I'd be impressed. Montserrat is a little tiny country as well, and then some of these are simply islands. When we look at the world distribution of GDP, it doesn't look equal, but I'm going to point out that some of it in particular makes more sense than others. You just have one of those pieces where some people started off with more of a possibility or a quality than others would necessarily have. And then just for fun, here you are with the states having more or less similar GDPs, and you'll notice that both France and Brazil are right up here with California and Texas as far as some of the top production. The next section we're going to look at is how you go from year to year. And I've got this in here, but I'm going to point out for most of my students, I've discovered that this is something you're already familiar with, that you already know how to measure growth. You've done it in physics or chemistry or biology. And so I'm going to point out that this formula, you're welcome to copy it, but it should already be familiar. For most of my students, this is not a significant change. We will keep referring back to it when we talk about CPI and GDP growth, but again, it's a common formula. You're welcome to go ahead and write it down if you want to, but when we're looking at percentage change, notice we have to multiply whatever we get by 100 because this is going to give you a decimal. You've got year 2 minus year 1 and then divide by year 1. So year 2 is 5,000, year 1 is 4,000, 5,000 minus 4,000 is 1,000. Divide that by our base year of 4,000, you should get a 0.25 or 25%. Transylvania over here, you've got 2,100 as its year 2, 2,000 as its year 1. 2,100 minus 2,000 should give you 100 and then over the 2,000, and go ahead and figure out the change for that. I will tell you that GDP does not accurately measure all of the pieces. Your total GDP is different from total growth. Take a look here. These are the 2017 fact book estimates, and the U.S. isn't even on there, but other countries you might not have expected. Ethiopia, Cambodia, and Djibouti have made it up as far as how much growth they're expecting. And then obviously these are the GDP at the bottom. Notice the United States is not here either. These are negative growth. You're not going to be surprised to see the Gaza Strip and Venezuela. We already know that they were struggling. GDP does not accurately measure the standard of living, mostly because you don't know if the economy is doing better or if it's actually meeting the population needs. So GDP per capita, or GDP divided by the population, is a much better measure of a nation's standard of living. That way we know how many people actually have their needs met. So this right here is the 10 most populated countries. I know, shock and awe, you don't see any countries you recognize up there. I'm also going to point out China and India are 4 times our size. And when we look at the GDP per capita in the first 10 countries, none of those 3 countries make it to the top of the list. The U.S. was up at the top of the list until about 5 years ago, and as you can see, we've moved significantly. These are significantly smaller nations. It makes it a whole lot easier to go ahead and have a GDP per capita. Even if they haven't evenly distributed the wealth, it's a lot easier when you have a much smaller group size or population size. The GDPs that some people have better come as a result of the economic system. Again, that would be that market system. The rule of law, where you have institutions or political stability. Capital stock, you have more machines or tools. Human capital with better education and training. And then natural resources. Quite a bit of this is something you can already see in the United States, where we have those added benefits. The things that are not included in the GDP, things like intermediate goods, things that are not things that are on their way to a final good. So he gives you the example of the price of a finished car as part of the GDP, but obviously not the radio or the tires, the things that go into the production of the car. Non-production transactions is a challenge because anything that is a used item does not count, including, by the way, a used house. People are not usually selling the new houses, or if you do, they're coming from the housing market, but anything that you've already owned a house for several years and you sell it, that's not going to count, as well as these things called financial transactions, and those are a little bit more challenging. But stocks and bonds, if we're selling shares, you're simply getting a piece of paper, nothing's being produced, and if nothing's being produced, you do not count. I'm going to point, services do count in this. So if you're selling a house, that service of selling a house would count. If you are a stock market analyst, you're getting paid for the analysis, that does count. This last part here about non-market illegal activities, obviously we're trying not to track illegal, we get that, but anything that is a household production, unpaid work, if you babysit and it doesn't get credited into the system, it doesn't count as part of GDP. There are 3 ways of calculating GDP. One is called the expenditures approach. We're looking at all the spending on the goods and services. One is called the income approach, looking at all the income earned. And one is called the value added approach, the dollar we add at each stage. I'm going to point out the income approach in particular is simply just the backwards approach of our expenditure approach. We're adding up the labor, the rental, the interest, and the profits, or the factor payments. And all those things should add up on the things that we in fact do spend. The expenditures approach is components of GDP. We have consumer spending, we have business investing, we have government spending, and we have net exports. And again, you've seen this X sub N for a while. We talked about that with Unit 5. All of these things together add up to Y, GDP. C plus I plus G, and it should be X of N. You're going to see that quite a bit, and you're probably going to want to actually memorize that one. It shouldn't be too hard. You've got the GDP breakdown here. We're going to come back to that, but it's not too hard to see. Most of it comes from personal consumption, although when the government changes some of this here with taxes or subsidies, we do see some changes here. Consumer spending is not particularly difficult. It's all the things you and I buy, so our services, the things that we're going to continue to use up, and then durable goods are just things that we continue to use over time. When we continue on, we're going to see what our investment is. And remember, you've already heard this before. This is my big red light. This is my sprinkles, right? Whenever you hear the word investment, we are not talking about the assets here. Okay, that was part of what we did before. Those were the things that we were investing money to make money, as in Unit 5. This is the second one. This is that investment where businesses are buying capital machines and resources, new ovens, more tractor trailers, bigger factories, because as we start producing more of those things, the consumer spending is also going to go up. Okay, so we've talked about whether it's just for consumer spending or investment spending. I'm reminding you this is where it really comes in and matters. When we start talking about consumer spending or investment spending, real estate counts as investment spending because potentially the new home can be counted out. And if it's used for the next year, remember that inventory, those are things that are held in storage. They're counted in the year they're produced, but not necessarily the year that they are sold. So anytime that a government or a system has to hold inventories, that's going to have a negative effect. Okay? Government spending is pretty easy. These are all the payments made by the government, anything that they are using for a good or a service, but it does not include things like transfer payments. Anything like this, welfare, Social Security, and subsidies, interest payments on the national debt, we are not creating anything, and therefore, again, there's no production of something, it does not count as actual spending. Okay? The U.S. government's share of GDP has changed over time. You can see the Great Depression here. And we're going to go ahead and give you a chance to see 1 through 10 which of these things you think are going to count. And if they don't count, you can cross them out. C plus I plus G plus X of N. Stop the video here and take a practice.